welcome to the Melancholy Guy, a companion podcast to my Tumblr blog, The Melancholy Guy, daring to be black, open, and free. The adventures of a divorced, open, polyamorous, African American male. I am the Melancholy Guy, Calvin, or CPJR if you know me. And definitely today, change I must or die I will. Today I definitely know that. Welcome to my podcast, my little podcast that I do about 3 times a week. The podcast is basically a companion to my Tumblr blog, which basically talks about my conversion or my going into the world of ethical non-monogamy. So basically, it was a process that started probably about 10 years ago, and throughout that time, I took the Tumblr and wrote about it. So now I'm just going back and examining those times, and really for myself, I'm taking a look back at my motivations as to why I made some of the decisions that I made and why I got some of the outcomes that I got. And some were good, some were bad. So if you've been listening or have heard some of the podcasts before, I've basically been talking about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, just talking about the internal thing that was going on with me. I kind of knew that I wasn't built for monogamy early on, and um, when I got into my second marriage, I kind of just accepted it, and then the process began within me as to how I was going to tell this woman that and how I was going to either work to keep us together or work for us to go our separate ways, but something had to change. I'm sorry about the coughing, but that had to be about year 3 of our marriage, and I've already talked about a lot of things, how I got or how I now realize that I wanted to go a different path. I wanted to go a path more into polyamory, which is to me more about emotional intimacy with others, loving others in that way, and sex may or may not be involved in with it, may or may not be involved in it. And she wanted to go another way, which was sexual intimacy, something like swinging. And I think we chose, or we made a deal, basically, to go into swinging, sexual intimacy with others, group sex, orgies, however you want to call it. That's what we decided to go into. That's what we did. So, but before we go into that, I know I said that last time I was gonna move on, but it was a couple of books that I read that helped me get to these decisions, and I wanted to emphasize those books. One book the first book that I actually read, and I think I actually heard about it from NPR. I used to be a big NPR listener, not anymore. But the book was it was called Against Love, a Polemic, and it was by Laura Kipnis. It's on Amazon, but Against Love. So basically, the book was talking about how um, we view love. We view it as something that we have to work at. It's not something that's natural, or once we get into a relationship, we have to work at the relationship. And she hypothesized that this came from the beginnings of this country, being that it came from a Puritan work ethic, and basically anything that was worth doing, you worked at it. So you're in a relationship, you're having hard times. That's just how it is. You work at it. There's a reward for working at it. You could be unhappy with how many years, as long as you're working at it, you're doing good. So basically, um, it wasn't about or marriage relationships, whatever. It's not about happiness. It's about working at it. So that was the first book I wrote, and then I read. I'm sorry that I read, and then I read the book. It's not even a polyamorous book. It was Sex at Dawn, by Christopher Ryan. It's like in my circle, almost everyone has read this book, and I'm basically at this point a fan of Christopher Ryan. He's does a podcast. He does a podcast with Duncan Trussell and Joe Rogan. Every now and then they call it the Shrimp Parade. Well, those three guys, especially Joe Rogan, Duncan Trussell, they're both comedians. I started listening to their podcasts a long ago. Joe Rogan's podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, was one of the first podcasts that I really listened to, and that really inspired me to want to get into podcasting because I saw his podcast start from scratch and then build up into what it is now, where it's listened to probably more than some television shows, and it's been going strong and will probably go on strong for as long as he does it, because it's interesting, it's mind expanding. It's an open forum where people are allowed to talk out their ideals, and he is kind of smart. Sometimes it gets to be too much because there is a bro component, there is a white privilege component to it. Sometimes I have to tune out because the perspectives are just all off. But I eventually come back. I basically have to pick the shows I want to listen to. Plus, he's in the MMA, and I'm not a big MMA fan. I'm not a big fan of any sports. But he's deep, and the whole, the tripping thing he talks about, and the exercise, taking care of yourself, eating well, hunting. Anyway, so those books opened up my mind to possibilities. Not only did it open up my mind to possibilities, but it enforced some things that were already working within me, right? I didn't just wake up and said, hey, I want some more of this, or I want some more of that. Let me go see what they about. Let me go see what this about. Because basically, when I got into ethical non-monogamy, there was no community. And I'll talk about, I will, get into what communities were available on Facebook, but the communities that for my demographic weren't there. There was nothing, pretty much. They were floundering. People were using other words for polyamory, but they were not talking about polyamory. They were not talking about open relationships the way that we talk about them now. So you were on your own, really, unless you wanted to join a cult-like thing. But it wasn't a cult-like thing. So anyway, I think that's where we were, and those two books helped me. Now, it's interesting. I was reading, my partner wasn't, because I think, like I said, we were on different tracks. So we're down to 5 minutes. So that's basically it. I think I'm going to go forward now, and come back next time with some readings from 6 years ago. And this starts to go into exactly where we were headed and how we actually ended up swinging. And I want to talk about what that process looked like, how it played out, how we got involved in the community and in the world and all that kind of stuff. But that's coming up. But reading was a big part of my process. I had to actually read in order to learn. That's what I do. I read, I research. I will not just do something. I will not just join a group without knowing what that group is about. So, like I said, those two books, and then I read some other books too. And it's interesting, I found on my blog, I didn't mention any books. I basically just read and just kept it moving, but I didn't document when or how I read those books. But those two books I definitely know I read before moving into anything else. And then we had podcasts that I read. And then I also want to talk about, while right before we actually got into swinging, I actually did try to pursue dating polyamorously. I actually went on OkCupid, set up a profile that she knew about, and almost had a first date before we went swinging. So I'll talk about that first date. I don't think I wrote about it, but it was an interesting first date. And it's something when you try to date your first time polyamorously and you're married. It was a weird situation, and the person who I first tried to date was white, and it was interesting. There was definitely some cultural differences, and I was really nervous, but I'll talk about that later. That was my only OkCupid date. Okay, I'm not a fan of online dating anymore, but OkCupid, I only dated one person after being on there for I don't know how many years. So that's it for the blog. Let's go into what's going on in my life right now. Hey, I start work on Monday. Got a job, passed the background check, passed the drug screen, and I'll be working on Monday. So, good things to come for the studio and the podcast. Like I said, that's just seed money for me, basically to build out my dream. So, that's a step in the right direction. I trust the process. I trusted the process, and this is, becoming reality. So I'm excited about that. I also want to talk about listen to another podcast called Multiamory, and it was a good episode where they were talking about the value of being single. Now, me myself, I have almost never been single. This will be the first time in life that I'm actually going to be single. I am single, and I'm going to be single. Although I do have friends, I'm going to be single. I'm not trying to pursue any type of fidelity, anything. I want to be single. I want to work on this, my studio, myself, my life, and that's my focus. Dating, all that, period. But there's a value in it. This time is going to be beautiful, and I believe that. So there's that Multiamory podcast. It's a very good podcast if you're interested in just relationships, polyamory, or a lot of relationship type issues. I recommend it highly. So I'm gonna give all my little things shout outs. My podcast is housed on Spreaker. It's only 15 minutes now because I'm using the free version. I will be upgrading soon, so I'm gonna expand these out. Probably a half hour to 45 minutes. The music comes from bensound.com. Give them a shout out because I get my intro outro music from there. The music I use from my clips, so I can keep using those for free. These are recorded out of my studio, which will be DMV Podcasters Studios in Maryland, and big things coming soon. So, thanks for listening if you do. Don't worry if you don't. But always remember to love and respect yourself first, and everything else will take care of itself. Peace and namaste.